I'm Tony Monaco, the president of Tufts University, and it's a joy to welcome you all this evening, and our distinguished speaker, Jane Burston. Welcome to Tufts and Fletcher. The Segal Lecture was originally established in 1973 by the late Dr. Maurice Segal, professor emeritus of the medical school, and also a member of the Tufts Board of Trustees and the Fletcher Board of Visitors. Dr. Segal was also a double jumbo, having graduated undergraduate in 1928 from Tufts and his doctorate in medicine in 1932. He was a prominent researcher in lung disease. Dr. Segal established the Tufts Lung Station in 1946, one of the nation's first centers for respiratory care and research. He was also a staunch supporter of Tufts, both at the medical school and here at the Fletcher School. So we're delighted to have Dr. Segal's son, Peter, class of 1965, and his wife, Carol, joining us virtually. I know they very much wanted to be here in person for this special lecture. Thank you for your family's generosity to Tufts so that we can make this lecture series possible year after year. Now, I would like to welcome the Dean of the Fletcher School, Rachel Kyte, who's going to introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much, President Monaco, for the very kind welcome and for being here this evening. I'd like to give a very special welcome also to friends and colleagues from the School of Medicine. I love seeing the two logos up there together, but also we've got colleagues here from the School of Nutrition, Friedman School, from Arts and Sciences. The Dean is even in the house, pleased to meet you, and from Engineering, from our veterinary school, and from across the entire university. So it's an important evening for us, and I think a testament to the interest level in Jane Burston's lecture. So this is the first Segal Lecture that we've held since 2019, which I recall hosting, having just arrived as the Dean at that point. And after 3 years of sort of being a little bit back to normal, but not quite, it's really thrilling to see you all in the room today, but also to see many of you more online. And it's really important, I think, that we would be looking at the subject of clean air, something which really pushes at the boundaries of health policy, international health policy and diplomacy, and at the boundaries of climate policy and how we can internalize climate policy in action. And it's very important, given that Dr. Maurice Segal was a pulmonologist, that we honor him in this way today. And so to our esteemed speaker tonight, Jane Burston. Jane is the founding executive director of the Clean Air Fund, a global philanthropy organization that works with governments, businesses, and NGOs to create a future where everyone can breathe clean air. The Clean Air Fund influences policy and decision makers to act on air pollution and partners with organizations that are driving data-driven policy change to improve global air quality. Before bringing together donors to set up the fund, Jane was head of climate and energy science in the UK, for the government, where she was responsible for the UK greenhouse gas inventory and a £45 million science programme. Previously, she led a team of 150 scientists working on energy and environment at the National Physical Laboratory. In 2020, she was featured by Wired magazine as one of their change makers of tomorrow, and she was named a Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum in 2012, as well as a Social Entrepreneur of the Year in the UK in 2011. She's a regular commentator and conference speaker, as well as a trustee of Parkinson's UK. So tonight we will have the pleasure of hearing from Jane on the intersection of crises in the health and climate spheres. I've watched carefully in the US, policymakers adopt language which they feel will allow more people to become active in changing the way our economy affects our health. I watched Lisa Jackson as President Obama's first EPA coordinator only speak about children's health. And then Gina McCarthy, no stranger to us here at Tufts, follow in her suit. And then as the climate coordinator under the Biden administration, watch Gina McCarthy talk consistently about children's health, much more than perhaps climate policy. I've also been humbled by Rosamond Adu-Kissi-Deborah, a secondary school teacher from the southeast of London, from Lewisham, who some of you may have heard about if you followed the clean air debate in the UK, who fought for her daughter's death certificate to actually state that Ella died 10 years ago because of air pollution. And she won. But now we'll hear from Jane a little bit, perhaps about how you take such a victory and make that turn into policy, which makes the breath that we breathe better for everyone. So it's intriguing, where every breath is so precious and where every breath makes a difference. How do you make sure that each of those breaths is clear, that it's free of particulate matter, that it's not toxic? Something so fundamental to us. Is that a concept around which people can organize if perhaps other concepts in climate change seem elusive? So these are some of the questions that I hope Jane will help us think about and help us answer. And so would you please join me in welcoming Jane Burston to give the Segal Lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, President Monaco and Dean Kyte, for the warm welcome and the very kind introduction. And I want to say a special hello as well to Peter Segal. Sorry you can't join us in person, but thank you very much for joining on Zoom. It's a real honor and privilege to be giving the Segal Lecture, having heard about Dr. Segal's history and how much he's clearly cared about people, had a vision, and was able to turn that into a reality. So I hope I can fulfill the brief of raising awareness, not just about the health harms of air pollution, but also about the people like Dr. Segal who are doing something about it. And I was going to start with this story that Dean Kyte just mentioned of Ella Kissi-Deborah. A girl who grew up in Catford in southeast London, who very tragically died in 2013 of a severe asthma attack when she was aged just 9. Now, asthma attacks weren't new for Ella. She suffered asthma so severely that she was hospitalized 28 times in the 3 years leading up to her death. And scientists looked into the data around those hospitalizations and realized that they coincided with peaks in air pollution by her home. Whenever she had gone to hospital, unfortunately, nobody had asked her where she lived. Because if they had, they'd have found out that she lived on the South Circular, which is one of London's most polluted and congested roads. We have this air pollution data because it's one of London's most polluted roads, and so that's where one of the main monitors are based. And it's this data that helped her mum, Rosamond, push for air pollution to be written as the cause of death on her death certificate, which, as Dean Kyte says, she achieved a couple of years ago. And now she's using that fact to try and push through very ambitious legislation that she's called Ella's Law through Parliament. But tragically, cases like Ella's, although it sounds rare, she's the first person to have air pollution written as the cause of death on her death certificate, it's not so rare. I mean, I don't know, I've spoken to a number of students and faculty members today who think about and work on air pollution a lot. Don't know whether anyone in the lecture knows how many premature deaths the World Health Organization would ascribe to air pollution globally, or what percentage? Have a guess, come on. 4.1 million, any other takers? Okay, well, somebody knows their facts. So 7 million deaths attributed to air quality, premature deaths by the World Health Organization. 4.1, 4.2 million of them to outdoor air pollution, which is the main thing that I'm going to be talking about today. And that's 15% of deaths globally. 15%, an incredibly large number. This is just for the sake of comparison with other other topics that we know about. And as well as these individuals, there are also many millions more people suffering from illnesses that are either caused by or exacerbated by air pollution and having their quality of life very severely affected. The groups that are most affected are often the most vulnerable. So we've talked about children, and they're vulnerable because they breathe close to the ground, whether they're in a stroller or they're walking. Concentrations of pollution are often much greater close to the ground. Some of it's heavy. We don't monitor down there. We monitor at the height of an average human man, like all science. And so, you know, we often don't know just how bad it gets where kids are breathing. They spend more time outside, often playing, and they're more physiologically vulnerable. They breathe faster, so they're taking on a kilo of body weight, and their organs are developing. So pollution can really affect developing lungs and developing brains. And the other groups that are more vulnerable, say, for example, low-income families, are also more exposed. You know, wherever you are in the world, the people who are least able to afford to move are the ones living next door to a busy road, next door to an industrial facility, and they tend to have either less access to healthcare or pre-existing health conditions that make them more physiologically vulnerable as well. So it's really an equity issue, as well as a climate and health issue. And unfortunately, last piece of bad news for the evening, the problem is getting worse. Unlike other environmental health risks, which we're fortunately tackling, air pollution, outdoor air pollution is forecast to get much worse over the coming decades, and for deaths to double by 2050 if we don't do something. So now for the good news. And there's lots of bits of good news. It's the main piece of good news is that there is a huge opportunity not just to save millions of lives and to improve lots of quality of life and improve equity, but also that in doing so at the same time, we can tackle climate change. Why? Well, the causes of climate change are very often the same as the causes of health harming air pollutants. About 2/3 of outdoor air pollution is caused by burning fossil fuels. So things like transport and traffic pollution, industry, domestic heating, domestic power, all of these fossil sources, and the solutions to using fossil fuels can be the same for air pollution as for climate change. Renewable energy, clean heating, transformation of industry, more public transport and electric vehicles. And you know, climate change, Dean Kyte alluded to this in her introduction, climate change is often politically divisive. And whilst people really genuinely care about climate change in the States, I think it's more than 2/3 of people say that they're somewhat or very concerned about climate change. It's about the same in the UK, it's about the same in many countries around the world. It's often hard for people to factor that into their day-to-day decision-making. You know, I'm in a rush, I've got to get the kids to school, I've got to get dinner on the table. Where does climate change come in my decision-making priorities? Oftentimes, air quality can seem more urgent, more tangible, more immediate, and people can feel that they have more agency over it. I noticed when I was working at the National Physical Laboratory and talking about air quality, that people would immediately leap to the sorts of things that they could do. Whereas when I gave talks on climate science, people were sometimes baffled. They would ask, you know, why would we do something when China is such a large emitter? And people just tended to feel a lot less agency over it. So in working on tackling air pollution, as long as we prioritize reducing those fossil fuel sources, we can get the health and the climate benefits at the same time. And so long as we factor in considerations of equity, make sure that the policies that we're putting in place aren't also harming those least able to afford, say, the new vehicle or to pay for their car to be driven into a city centre, then we can tackle equity issues at the same time. Another major opportunity of tackling air pollution is the economic benefit, because tackling air pollution can pay for itself many times over. You immediately think, well, I immediately think when I think of the economic benefits of reducing air pollution, of the health system cost. So avoiding having to pay in the national health system for treating the people that are sick because of air pollution. But we funded, at the Clean Air Fund, we funded the Confederation of British Industries Economics Division to work out what the economic benefit to business would be of reducing pollution in the UK. And even in a relatively lower pollution environment like the UK, these are the numbers that they came up with. This is the economic benefit of reducing pollution from the level that it's at the minute to what the World Health Organization at the time was recommending. So it's about a 50% reduction in pollution. Once that new level had been reached, 3 million additional working days would be gained each year for people who previously would have been sick or at home looking after sick kids that can now show up to work. And the benefit of that is to British industry, 1.6 billion every year. So this does not even include the health system cost. It also doesn't include the short-term cognitive benefits of being able to concentrate better. There's quite a bit of research, mostly out of China, on how even small increases in air pollution inside a factory, for example, have really quite significant productivity impacts. And that's not included in this number either. We funded a very similar piece of research in India through Dalberg, the consultancy, and with the Confederation of Indian Industry. And in India, the cost to the economy, to the private sector, was $95 billion, which is about 3% of Indian GDP. And that was also not including issues for specific sectors like international tourism or the fact that retail footfall drops quite significantly on high air pollution days. Nor does it factor in the long-term cognitive decline if kids are trying to concentrate and do their schooling in a high pollution environment, what that means for their future earning prospects. So a huge potential benefit if we can prioritize the climate action that also reduces pollution. So what are people doing with this? Is there momentum building? Is there change happening as a result of all of this research? Well, yes, I think there's a huge amount of momentum led by the research. This is a very quick and dirty analysis of the increase in research studies that have been done over the last decade. Just simply publications that are tagged as health and air pollution. We didn't do any independent analysis on how accurate the tagging is, but the trend is clear. There's been this huge uptick in academic research on air quality, and what has followed is if you're going to draw the same chart of public concern, mentions in the media, mentions in political speeches, institutional interventions, new laws, the charts look the same. Funding, international philanthropic funding and development agency funding. I mean, we're in the foothills. There's still a huge amount to be done because we're starting from an incredibly low base here. But just as an example, with the funding, philanthropic funding to air quality is, I think, 0.1% of all philanthropic funding. Development agencies, it's 0.5%. So there's still a lot more to be done, but that's an increase from near zero historically. So I wanted to leave you, because I know we're going to get in conversation and I'm looking forward to hearing all of your questions and opinions, but I wanted to leave you with 3 examples of what this momentum is transferring into in the world. A local and national example, a regional one, and a global one. So we do a lot of work in Poland, and some of the partner organizations that we work with produced this poster. It's lungs. They're made out of the same filter paper that air pollution monitors use, and they used to be white. So just like an air pollution monitor, which is white filter paper with a vacuum behind, so it sucks pollution onto the paper, as do these lungs. They went black over the course of a week. We had the similar poster in an area in London called Putney, where I used to live on the high street. It took 2 weeks. Same poster in Lucknow in India, it took 2 days. And people see this and they see, this is what's happening inside my lungs. In India, I know that the organization, we hadn't funded this work, but the organization who did it then chopped this filter paper into little pieces and posted it off to politicians so that they could have this, they could stick this postcard on their wall, and they could have a piece of this black lung to remind them of what action needed to be taken. So grassroots organizations have mobilized people, they've produced very visible ways of raising awareness like this. And as a consequence, they've had a couple of really big wins in the last year. In the central region of Poland, Masovia region, which is where the capital city is, domestic coal burning has been banned in Warsaw from this year, and in the rest of the region from 2028. And also on a national level, new legislation has been passed that means low emission zones are possible for the first time. And 12 mayors have committed to putting in place low emission zones where they charge for the most polluting vehicles. On a regional level, again in Europe, the European Commission has just put out very strict environment air quality standards for consultation. So we're supporting action to make sure that these are accepted. And on a global level, some of the world's biggest companies have come together to form the Alliance for Clean Air with the World Economic Forum. And for the first time ever, they're going to be measuring the air pollution footprint of a company, reporting that, setting reduction targets, and working together to raise awareness with their constituents. So I will leave you with those examples. Very much look forward to your questions, and thank you so much for listening.
Oh, yep. So those lungs, huh?
Mm.
That's like 40 woodbines, as my grandfather would get through. So you work all over the world, and I think what we got a sense of is that some things are true, and then every country's political economy, every city's political economy is different, right? Where does the pushback come once the population understands that it's breathing toxic air? I mean, that must be terrifying. So then how do you build momentum around that? And what have you learned about the pushback?
Yeah, I mean, there is still, even though it's true that people can be more focused on the health impact of climate action because it's more local. And it's true that it's hard to argue against children's health, for example. There is still opposition, as there always will be. I think it's where the action required is quite fundamental behaviour change. So an example we've seen in London recently is the ultra low emission zone, where it started in the centre of London. It's now been expanded to a really very significant percentage of London, about 5 million people. And there's very strong compliance. And now the mayor is suggesting expanding it again to cover the whole of London, so 10 million people. Public transport isn't as good in the outer area of London, and so part of the package that the mayor has introduced is additional public transport, a scrappage scheme to help people convert their vehicles. There's lots of incentives, people who have to drive their car and are disabled have a specific scheme to enable them to change their vehicle. But still, there will be people who don't want to give their old diesel car up, and they don't like the scheme. So I think there's all a mayor can do is provide as many incentives as there are, as many carrots as there are sticks, and hope that the grassroots organisations come out and support.
So one of the reasons, when you were telling the story of Rosamund and Ella,
yeah,
one of the things you made the point was that there was an air quality monitor right on the South Circular, right, so on this really horrible, busy, congested road. So how do you build a constituency for action on clean air in countries where those monitors, because you've been very data driven, yeah, it seems, in the work that you've done. So do we have to sort of fight for air quality monitors in cities around the world? Is that happening?
Yes. So yes, we do have to fight for them. And so my background is this National Physical Laboratory. And one of the things that one of the teams in my department did there was test the new lower cost sensors. And they're useful for some things. So they won't give you the correct absolute number, but they can tell you, is this street more polluted than that street, or is it more polluted today than it was yesterday? And there was a view that they were never going to be useful for kind of regulation or for changing government action. And an example that I saw in Bulgaria really changed my mind about that. A very committed citizen started buying low-cost sensors, distributing them around. He got his friends to stick them on their balconies. And whilst the absolute numbers weren't correct, they were the ones making the data transparent in a way that the government was not. And the government said, take this down, these numbers aren't right. And the government was correct too, the numbers weren't spot on. But the fact that they didn't produce their number meant that this was the only data people could use. So as a consequence of this action by the citizens, the government then started publishing the real data. And now that same group of citizens is still doing their monitoring, but they're also advocating for the monitors to be moved to more sensible locations, away from parks, towards some of the more congested junctions, so that we get a properly accurate picture of the pollution levels. So I think, citizen advocacy can be useful in lots of ways. And then sometimes it's getting the data where there is none. And sometimes it's pushing the government to be transparent about the data that does exist. But we absolutely need monitoring everywhere. And there's still many, especially African countries, that have none at all.
So you said we had an opportunity to have coffee this morning. You said something really that's just stuck with me all day, which is that if you're afraid of being ill, that may spur you into action. But if you think it's going to kill you, then that actually may suppress your sort of response to it. So you talked about WHO's mortality figures, but the morbidity figures must be extraordinary. And then there's all this recent research on what it's doing to the cognitive capability of young kids. And I remember when I first got briefed on some of that research, it's really terrifying as a parent so how does this sort of combination of scaring people a little bit and getting them to ask for action, it seems to me that this balance is a big theme in a lot of climate action and in a lot of public health action, right? You're a little bit frightened, but if you're too frightened, you just paralyze, right? You freeze, you don't do anything.
Yeah, and I think if you with the death statistics in particular, people find it just very difficult to believe that will be them. So yeah, there's lots of focus group research about how the most compelling messages to motivate action are the ones based around the avoidance of disease, because I can imagine that I might get lung cancer, but I can't imagine dying. So yeah, I think one of the key things that we've found is making the data as local as possible so that people can see themselves in it. There's lots of stats like some of the ones that I've shown that are global in nature, and that also, even if you live in a very polluted place, that also makes you think that's not me, that's happening elsewhere. And so we have funded quite a bit of work to translate that very compelling global health evidence for very specific places. How much more likely would I be to get lung cancer if I live on a busy road in Birmingham or in Warsaw or in Accra than if I lived in the countryside in that same place? And those are the things, like working with scientists to make sure that the statements that are being made by campaigners are scientifically credible, but that they're couched in language that your average person can understand and message tested so that it's the things that are most compelling to people, is something that we've spent quite a bit of time on.
So we've got microphones, so I'm going to ask one last question, and then please assemble peaceably by the microphones, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So my last question is a personal one. So you're in a university, you're in a school of full of people who are building international careers or careers in public health and other aspects of making the world a better place. So your careers had a few dog legs in it, right, as we say. I
Very
mean, you've
zigzaggy.
had a portfolio
Yeah.
career, which is what everybody's building here. Do you have advice for this esteemed bunch of change makers? Or, I mean, that must have been quite gutsy, right? I mean, you're a non-scientist in the laboratory. You've done interesting things, and then this was a whole new thing, right? There was nothing in the space. You just occupied it. Where did the courage come from?
None of it felt difficult or scary at the time. I think I've gone from I just see where I feel like I could have the next biggest impact and jump there. I think especially at the MPL, after a few months where everybody assumed that I had a PhD in physics and I didn't have an A level yet, I do now. That was quite frightening, but the move didn't wasn't scary right then. So I think advice wise, the worst advice I ever got was plan your career out, think about where you want to be 5 years from now. It's the kind of typical career center question that you get asked, and I just think it's a terrible question, because I would have done none of the things that I'd done if I'd been doing things for the sake of the next thing and plotting out a path. Opportunities come up and your interest changes, and where you think you can have the biggest impact changes over time. So don't think about it, do what the most fun thing is.
Okay, I think fun's the operative word here. For the members of the Office of Career Services of Fletcher, I hope you're taking notes. So do we have questions from the audience? Here we go. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for all your work. I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby. So for years, we've been advocating for putting a price on carbon or pollution. And I'm wondering what you think of that. And also we use the En-ROADS climate simulator program. And in that they will show you like everything that affects the climate and how it impacts if you do something about coal or improve solar. And and they conclude that putting a price on pollution is the most effective thing to do. So I'm wondering about that. And if I could sneak in 2 more questions. One is what you think of natural sequestration and mechanical sequestration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'll answer all of these while I'm taking another one. My brain isn't big enough to remember more than 3. So putting a price on carbon, I think, is an incredibly good idea. However it's done, whether it's a tax or an emissions trading scheme, with pollution, you'll have seen from the data, we've tried really hard to make the price of pollution clear, because what we know is even if the Environment Department or the Health Department and the government decides to do something, they then have to get it past the Treasury. And what the Treasury will say is this isn't affordable. So while you'll have the costs of action on the one hand, you also need the benefits. So I very much am in favor of putting a price on carbon and making it super clear, even before we have that, what price we're paying for climate inaction. And on sequestration, it's so necessary. I think Dean Kyte is probably a better place to answer the question than me. But there's a huge chunk of decarbonisation that needs to be represented by natural sequestration. I don't have a strong opinion on any of the new technologies, but perhaps
you have to go to a place down the road. I think where they're working on a few of those. So no, but I think we're deep into territory of reducing emissions, right? So making choices about energy, sources of energy, transportation choices, etc. As you know, in CCL, and thank you for all your hard work. But also we're deep into the territory of having to remove emissions now. And I think over the next, this is the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, over the next 24 months, I'm looking at some of the students right there. I think we're going to start to see negotiations around effective ways to remove emissions. So Ada, hi. Talking of graduate students.
Can you hear me? There we are. Hi, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Etta Cosma. I'm a second-year master's student here at the Fletcher School. And I'm doing some of my master's research around national greenhouse gas inventories. And I was really, curious if you could tell us more about the work that you're doing to start thinking about how we might quantify and collect that data around air pollution that is being emitted by companies, excuse me. I think, what struck me is like Google, you don't necessarily think of their operations as being, as carbon intensive. Certainly computing and processing power, that's different types of air pollution, but could you just talk more about that project? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, of course. So it's quite new. This alliance was launched at the Glasgow Climate Conference about just over a year ago. And there's three things that so to step back, why bother doing something with these big companies? So we know that, as I said, the momentum in kind of research and public concern and institutional interventions on air quality are all is raising quite significantly. The same was not true for corporate action. So there's barely any companies talking about air quality. So one of the first things that we did was with the Confederation of Indian Industry, set up a Chief Executives Forum on clean air. And what we saw was that has a real benefit of talking about air quality with the public in a different way. If there's a government or if people think that pollution is a necessary consequence of economic development, it's actually businesses that can best persuade people out of that opinion and say, actually, it's harming our business, it's harming productivity. So that's why I get businesses involved. And on a global level, it's the kind of thing that can really accelerate action if there's a group of businesses voluntarily doing something that then might come along the line as mandatory later. And we're seeing this now in Europe. So this group of businesses have committed to three things. One is this measuring their air pollution footprint and once they've got the baseline, setting a reduction target and reporting publicly on it. And on that one, over the course of the last year, they've funded the Stockholm Environment Institute to produce a guide, and that's now available online. And they'll all be publishing their pollution footprints shortly. That guide can now potentially be the methodology, because it's the first time it has ever been attempted, can potentially be the methodology for some mandatory corporate reporting that's coming in across the EU in 2024. Every company bigger than 500 employees will have to report their air pollution footprint. So, but there was no means of calculating that. So it was possible that would be removed from the corporate sustainable reporting directive, because companies could quite fairly have said, how will we do this? So now there's a way for them to do it, which has been tested by some of the biggest names going. But to your point about Google, I would agree. And I think that for many of the companies, the reporting on air pollution footprint is simply a hygiene factor. And the other two commitments that they made will be where the substantial action happens. And those other two commitments are to talk about air pollution and how to avoid it with their stakeholders. So that might be speaking with governments about the need for stricter regulation, supporting ambitious politicians and what they're trying to achieve. It might be talking with customers or employees about what they could do. And the third commitment is to somehow use their business assets to drive change. And something that Google has been doing with their Street View cars is putting reference grade air quality monitors in the car. And as the car drives around doing the mapping and taking photos, they're also sampling pollution every 30 meters. So they've been able to build up, for the cities where they've done it, the most granular picture of air pollution ever achieved. IKEA have been buying, so one of the sources of air pollution in India at certain times of the year is crop stubble burning. The farmers harvest a crop, burn the remainder, and then quickly plant the next crop. And IKEA has been, instead of allowing that to be burned, buying that crop stubble and turning it into straw products. So I think that like that third one for me is the super exciting one. where, you know, if you could imagine if Google put air pollution on Google Maps every single time you looked at it, you could see the route that you could take that would reduce your exposure or your pollutants the most. That would be quite compelling and would really start to get people thinking about the pollution levels that they're exposed to. In order to get them there, they need to have figured out their own impact first, because otherwise it's difficult for them to talk about it. So I think you're right. The servers is probably not the most polluting activity you can imagine, but it's a necessary before they start to work on other things.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this interesting presentation. I actually, I'm very curious to know more about, like, for developing nations. It's really difficult for the government to get a budget to actually put air quality sensors all over, and maybe they don't even care that much. So I'm just curious to know also your perspective, if it's kind of like, if there is a business case for maybe companies in developed nations to maybe fund this initial air quality sensors and put them, you know, in specific nations, collect this data, and maybe use that for specific, you know, profitable purposes, either with the government or with, you know, other entities. But I'm just thinking, like, if just not to depend on the government to kind of take that initiative. So I'm just curious to know more about that, and if you've experienced something like that somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, there's huge opportunity for businesses to step in and other organizations. There's a story about the US embassies who have air pollution monitors on all of their buildings, and the engineer who set the pollution monitors up had different names for the different amounts of pollution, and they named the kind of top bracket crazy bad, and apparently then, you know, that's the reference grade monitor that everybody in Beijing was looking at when they didn't trust the government monitors, because the US one was always reading quite a lot higher. And so then it got to crazy bad, and that went viral, and that's one of the things that people point to when they're looking at how quickly change happened on air quality and the government's attitude towards it in China. So for sure, an independent, trusted entity in countries where either there's no data or citizens don't trust government data would be very useful. And actually, some of the businesses on that list are thinking about maybe doing that on their headquarters. So I think it's a very useful service that they could provide. But there's also a lot of potential in these lower cost sensors to bring the cost down to an affordable level for developing countries. And I do think that there's still the business case for them to do it. You know, the government ought to be the ones funding this long term, because you need it to understand what the sources are and whether the policies that you're implementing are making any difference.
Please.
Jane, thank you very much for your presentation. My name's John Howe. I'm an alumnus of the Fletcher School, and I've been working in clean energy since I was here in the 80s as a student. I think the consensus in the public here in America, and I think in Britain, is that clean air regulation has by and large been a great success. It's much less of a problem today in developed countries than it was in the 70s and 80s. We can point to successes on the front of reducing acid rain, and emissions trading schemes have by and large been quite successful. So it's alarming to hear you say that the forecast is for a doubling of impacts over the coming decade. And I'm wondering if this is because of the increased industrialization in the developing world and the failure to use state-of-the-art technologies and have the same kind of air regulation, regulatory frameworks. And I wonder if you could offer a word on how the nature of the problem has changed over these decades. For example, particulate emissions were a serious problem here in the States half a century ago. We seem to have addressed well the problem of large particulates, but smaller particulates can pose more of a threat to to small children and their lungs. So there are problems that are getting better, but there are other problems perhaps that are getting worse. I wonder if you could address that issue.
I can try. Thank you. Yes, it was a doubling by 2050 if we don't do anything different. And you're right that those deaths are predominantly in low and middle income countries. There's a lot of urbanization and development without thought for how to not bake in polluting sources from the beginning. We've just recently set up an office in Accra in Ghana, and I went and visited a city called Tamale, which pre-pandemic was one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And until very recently, about 95% of the trips there have been done by two-wheeler, so bicycle or motorbike. And when I went there, I've never been before, but there's the most beautiful tarmacked road, very recently built, but no bike lane. And the car that I was traveling in was like, they can go fast because there's no potholes, and they're beeping at these cyclists, kind of running them off the road. And it did make me think, in London, we're trying really hard to get people back on their bicycles. Here's a city where people are naturally traveling by bicycle, and we build infrastructure that makes it unsafe, much riskier thing to do, and very unpleasant for people. So the lack of joined up thinking on kind of economic development and reducing pollution sources is baffling to me. And even in the kind of climate and health worlds, climate budgets don't have health metrics. There's no way of accounting for health benefits in climate funding. Same for health. There's no way of accounting for climate benefits. And it just means that we're constantly missing a trick where we could fund something that would have multiple benefits, and we don't, because the metrics by which we decide are wrong. And then your question about which things are getting worse. I mean, I think some of it is the more we learn, the worse things get. Scientists are just naturally conservative in their assumptions. And there's just some things that we haven't known about, like the ultrafine particles that you were talking about, that aren't even measured because we don't have the monitors to do it. And so that now we find out, recent research is that I read recently 30% of miscarriages in Southeast Asia are attributed to air pollution. There's links between air pollution and dementia, Parkinson's disease. These are new links that we haven't seen before. And so it can appear that the situation is getting worse, but it's just that we understand it better. I mean, I think it is also getting worse. But I would say ultrafine particles is probably, as you point out, the main area where we're learning new things.
Slide, please.
Hi. Hi, my name is Ronak. I'm a second-year master's student. I'm also from New Delhi, so this issue matters a lot to me. Thanks for your presentation. There's a lot of emerging research, particularly in large cities, looking at the correlation between air pollution and housing markets and the changes to property rates. I'm wondering what you think the implications of that could be, particularly on low-income groups and gentrification. Is there any, is this a factor that's come up in the research you funded at all? Thank you.
Yes, I have seen similar. I hadn't seen it in Delhi actually, but there's a group in the UK that's trying to publish air pollution data and make it affect house prices in order, as a kind of advocacy aim, in order that people then really make sure that pollution gets fixed outside their home because they don't want their house price to drop. But it is a very good point, the gentrification. And we focus on that when we're looking at city-based policies. There's lots of evidence that, for example, the wider the geographical area of the policy, the more equitable, because as soon as you start doing very specific urban developments or very contained low emission zones, for example, gentrification issues come up, and in fact the potential to push more pollution to the lower income areas, as say, for example, vehicles move to the streets that are not controlled. So we always will make sure that the policymakers can see the evidence and take it into account when they're figuring out where exactly to do the policy and how big an area it should cover.
Taking me back to my old job, where informal settlements on roads was always the big issue, right? You would move people away and they were income, but then lower income people would move in and sort of live in shanties along the main road because that was the easiest place and that was the filthiest air. So
it is interesting. Like I had a hypothesis that got blown apart during the pandemic, that the more local the intervention, the more support it would get. And it might have been execution, how it was executed, but there was a fund in the UK for closing off streets on a neighborhood level, low traffic neighborhoods it was called, where people would get funding to put planters at the end of a street so that it made it into a dead end, so you couldn't use it as a cut through. And it was a way of reducing pollution during the pandemic when people's respiratory systems were being challenged. And the amount of polarization it has created in the UK is off the charts. Like the wars on Twitter. And I even saw one photo of, so one of these planters had a wooden bench. They're very cheap ways of blocking off streets, had a wooden bench and somebody had hammered nails up through it. This is how much people hate it. So like very local interventions can also make people very angry if they, and one of the reasons why some people have got angry is apparently because traffic is being pushed to the streets where lower income people are more likely to live. The data actually doesn't necessarily back that up, but that's one of the reasons that they give.
So I'm going to take the three people who are standing quick questions and we'll answer them. Thank you, please.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my name is Olivia Ann Carey Hallstein. I'm a local artist and activist. So the example you used about from Poland with the lungs really stuck to me, and my mind went directly to brown coal production and wood burning production, which is a huge part of the GDP in Poland, right? So my question relates to that, as well as the increased pressure through the Ukraine war on fossil fuel, dependency, or starting in some places starting to use more of that coal as a result of those prices. So how does civilian pressure combine with economic and social need to help make decisions about this reduction? And how is it possible to ensure the success in the face of pressures like war? Quick question. It's too much.
You'd like to offer your opinion and give me a break. Yeah, I mean, it is very tricky. Interestingly, the domestic coal burning ban in the Masovia region got passed since the outbreak of the war. But it is very, and I know that many people are aware that lots of Russian gas was sold to Poland, also Russian coal. So it was easier for them to close off the coal contracts because they have a domestic source of coal, but like you say, it's more heavily polluting. I think it's really tricky for the politicians because, like with the London example, they are always trying to offer the incentives and the subsidies at the same time as the restriction. And Poland has benefited a lot from EU subsidy for domestic heat pumps and a switch over from coal boilers. That actually the subsidy used to be used to switch from a old coal boiler to a new coal boiler. Now that is thankfully not possible. But the incentive schemes are there, and the government's job needs to be to try and help citizens, especially the lower income households that find it harder to access those kind of subsidies because of the difficulty of the paperwork or other barriers to access them. But it's getting tough, and it's getting tough especially for city mayors, where a lot of this rubber is hitting the road.
Please. So.
Hello, thank you for coming. I'm Jacob Tots, a student at Tufts University. She asked my question, so I'm going to broaden my question a bit. You said that the causes of air pollution are very similar to the causes of climate change, and a big factor is emissions from burning fossil fuels. What would you like to see happen with the oil and gas industry?
That's a big question. I mean, I think for the start, to remove the subsidies that they already get. We're talking about subsidizing switch over to renewable technology, but actually if you just removed subsidies from the oil and gas companies and created a level playing field in the first place, things would be a lot better. So maybe I will just pick that one and leave it there. There are many other things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The subsidies are up in the last 2 years. So we didn't learn the lesson when you saw those charts just with emissions just collapse in March 2020. The degree, I think it's now $770 billion worth of subsidies a year.
Hi, my name is Lian. I'm from Burma. Thank you for your wisdom and the work that you're doing. My question is about the allocation of resources, the funds in regards to like regions and countries that are facing civil war and conflicts and those steps. And in that case, what should be the international institutions' role in tackling air pollutions? Like a few years ago, I was in Yangon, and my friends from Germany, he always showed me how polluted Yangon is. And then he would encourage me to wear a mask even before COVID. Yeah, I'm wondering what could be done more to regions that are facing a conflict. I know when I look at the list, it's very high. Like most of the countries that are facing civil wars are prone to these air pollutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there are huge disparities in where the international funding goes. There's a report that we produce actually every year on the state of global funding for air quality. And it shows that most of the money goes to China and India on air quality. There's very little actually goes to African countries and Latin American. Southeast Asia is probably next after India and China. And I think it's interesting that the funding seems to kind of chase pollution around the world. You know, we see where it's getting polluted and we pay to shut stuff down, rather than like this Tamale example, pay to have not created it in the first place. I'm not sure how conflict and civil war comes into that, and how you would prioritize countries that are experiencing conflict in this mix, but certainly there's a big imbalance. And I don't think that donors are thinking strategically about pollution avoidance and maybe rebuilding post-conflict as opposed to shutting things down.
Well, so first of all, thank you for some excellent questions. And thank you, Jane. Thank you for just opening the window a little bit into air quality as something that is so fundamental to our health, but also fundamental to the planet's health. Good luck in all that you do. We've got highly motivated students in many of the jurisdictions in which you may want to work. So I think you've set off many ideas here. And here at Tufts, we aspire, well, we hold a very centrally our ethic of being civically engaged, of producing citizens that are going to go and take what it means to be a citizen in the 21st century to heart and do something with it. Many of my fellow deans are here, and this is very important to who we are. And I think this sits quite centrally in what it means to make the world a better place. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Jane Burston. Thank you. And to those of you online, in particular to Peter Segal and the family, I hope that Maurice would approve of this lecture. Thank you very much indeed. Good evening.